a shadow in the night, a man preying on girls ages 13 to 21. Yet he managed to hide from the law for 30 years until he finally came forward himself. In the late 80s, a famous author's daughter was slain. Law enforcement would not realize it, but it was in fact not because of the author's fame. It was instead connected to various other slayings of young women in the vicinity. The assailant would come forward decades later as a surprising retirement plan. The victims, unsuspecting, were as follows. 21-year-old Althea Oakley was a student at the University of New Mexico. She was a go-getter with many bright prospects ahead. On June 22, 1988, Althea went to attend a party. It was at her boyfriend's fraternity. Everything was going great. She had a few drinks, but was not drunk or intoxicated. She got into an argument with her boyfriend. Words were exchanged. Not one to take needless attitude. She went out the door and decided to walk back home. Althea and her brother shared a house, so she walked south along Buena Vista Drive. That was the last time her friends saw her alive. According to reports, a woman heard screaming outside her house at 1320 Buena Vista Drive. It was the middle of the night, so she did not go outside, terrified of what might be out there. That woman, who chooses to remain anonymous, would testify years later. It was Althea screaming and fighting for her life. She was found fatally stabbed several times. An autopsy would reveal she had been severely intimately assaulted as well. 2 years later, her family established a scholarship in her memory to honor Althea. It was called the Oakley Scholarship. The first recipient of that scholarship would go on to become the chief of police in Albuquerque. That man tried everything in his power to get that case to progress, but it was all to no avail. This man is Chief Harold Medina. He knew Althea personally and vowed to do something to bring her parents and brothers some peace. 13-year-old Stella Gonzales was a student who attended Washington Middle School in Albuquerque and was known for her bubbly personality and love of jokes. On September 9, 1988, Stella was walking back home after a party, accompanied by a friend, somewhere near Tingley Beach. It is just that age where your parents trust you with a few decisions in life. Tragically, Stella's mother, Gina Cirillo, could never have known how much that would cost her. Gina was not in favor of sleepovers, but she allowed her daughter to stay the night at her aunt's house. She would be safe there. She did not know the girls would attend a party or walk home alone. She had no way of knowing this. Gina would later learn that the teenager had convinced her aunt to let her go out with a friend, and the two went to a party on the west side. Around 1:15 a.m., they were walking home when tragedy struck. Stella was not even alone. She was walking with her friend when an unknown suspect shot her in the head, cruelly. There was no reason for her to lose her life. The family had no enemies. She was a child. There were no signs of assault either. Even though she was rushed to the hospital, she lost her battle with the gunshot wounds almost 2 days later. Kaitlyn Arquette was born to author Lois Duncan on September 18, 1970. Lois penned the famous novel, I Know What You Did Last Summer. On June 14, 1989, 18-year-old Kaitlyn graduated from Highland High School in Albuquerque, New Mexico. As a popular and outgoing honors student, Kaitlyn had recently been accepted to the University of New Mexico with aspirations of attending medical school. Shortly after high school graduation, she moved in with her boyfriend Dung Nguyen, using money from an insurance settlement. Kaitlyn's mother was aware of the arrangement, although not fully informed about the boyfriend's age. He was actually 8 years older than Kaitlyn, but her family had been led to believe he was only 4 years older. Despite this, the family liked him as he appeared to be a nice guy and was often around the house. Unfortunately, they did not know this, but Kaitlyn and Dung were involved in an insurance scam. They got the money, but he was afraid they would get caught. 6 weeks later, on July 16th, Kaitlyn confided in her mother about the serious problems she had been having with her boyfriend since they moved in together. She asked her mother to lie to him about her whereabouts, emphasizing the urgency of her situation. Kaitlyn explained that she had a big fight with Dung, was breaking up with him, and planned to go to a friend's house for dinner. She intended to either spend the night there or return to her parents' house, but she was not going back to the apartment. She wanted Dung to move out so this friend could move in as a roommate. She would feel safer. That night, Kaitlyn visited her friend, Sharon Smith, from 9:30 p.m. to 10:45 p.m., then headed east along Lomas Road towards her mother's house. On her way home, somewhere in the city's Old Town, a car pulled up alongside her, and someone inside shot her. She was shot twice in the head, which caused her car to drift between lanes and crash into a light pole. Officers arrived around 11 p.m. and made note of a gray Volkswagen Beetle at the scene. Off-duty Detective Ronald Merriman was the first officer at the scene, where he saw 2 cars parked on the sidewalk. He also saw a man named Paul Apodaca standing next to Kaitlyn's car. Merriman initially called in a report of an accident with no injuries before returning to the scene. Upon his return, he found Kaitlyn unconscious and covered in blood, thrown across the front seats of her car. Officer Marianne Wallace arrived at the scene within a minute of being dispatched and observed only Kaitlyn's car, with Merriman and Paul Apodaca standing behind it. Merriman informed Wallace that Kaitlyn had been injured in a traffic accident and that he had called for an ambulance. However, Wallace noticed a bullet-shattered driver's side window and realized it was a crime scene, not a car accident. She then called for backup. Merriman and Wallace claimed that they opened the passenger door of Kaitlyn's car and found her bleeding heavily from her head. However, the medics from Albuquerque Ambulance, who transported Kaitlyn to the hospital, stated in affidavits that they responded to a routine call and found no police officers, police cars, or bystanders at the scene when they arrived. They reported that Kaitlyn was still alive, moaning and bleeding from her head, but no one was there providing her with first aid. A little before midnight, Lois Duncan received a distressing phone call from the hospital emergency room. The hospital informed her that Kaitlyn had been injured, but would not provide details over the phone. Lois and her husband, Don, rushed to the hospital, where they learned that Kaitlyn had been shot twice in the head and was in a coma. A famous author's daughter in the hospital is bound to get attention. Detective Steve Gallegos showed up at Kaitlyn's apartment to question her boyfriend Dung. So as not to affect the boy's answers, he did not disclose Kaitlyn's shooting or accident. Dung showed them a note that read, "Han, I will be back home by 10. He claimed she had written the note, which the detective kept as evidence. The boy was informed about the accident and became distraught. After the police left, Dung went to the hospital to be by her bedside. Within a day, Kaitlyn succumbed to her injuries and passed away. Her tragedy made national news. Her mother was a famous writer, and years later, she would even write a book about her ordeal. A fictitious novel, but a book on the circumstances surrounding Kaitlyn's demise. A man living nearby reported hearing what sounded like gunshots, and then saw a Volkswagen Bug speeding away from the scene. However, Detective Ronald Merriman did not see this, and there were no reports of late-night high-speed chases in downtown Albuquerque that night. Police used the written directions they found on the floor of Kaitlyn's car to lead them to Sharon Smith's house. Sharon told APD that Kaitlyn arrived at her home at 9:30 p.m. However, Sharon later made considerable effort to locate and phone Kaitlyn's family, who had moved out of state, to tell them that Kaitlyn arrived at her home at approximately 7 p.m., having come directly from a 5 p.m. dollar movie at a nearby theater. This was impossible since Kaitlyn had left her parents' house at 6:15 p.m. She could not have attended that movie. During her phone conversation with Kaitlyn's mother, Sharon described her final evening. She said Kaitlyn seemed very upset, kept bursting into tears for no apparent reason, and made Sharon phone her apartment over and over to see if Dung was there. She did not want to speak to him, just to nail down his whereabouts. There was never an answer. Sharon dialed the apartment for the final time at 10:40 p.m. There was still no answer. A few weeks later, Lois found out something troubling, something that was a clue. There were 3 phone calls from Kaitlyn's apartment, almost at the exact time she passed away. since both Kaitlyn and her boyfriend were at the hospital. Who was this mystery caller? The calls were made minutes after she had been pronounced deceased. The number, oddly, belonged to a paralegal in Orange County, a Vietnamese paralegal. According to neighbors, Kaitlyn was afraid of Dung's friends, especially when they only spoke in Vietnamese around her. They would make fun of her, and there was an air of hatred. Was all this connected somehow? The police conducted 6 months of thorough investigations and concluded that it was just a random act of violence. Perhaps a mugging gone wrong, or she got caught up in a gang war. But Lois refused to believe this. She knew there was something deeper at play here. She vowed not to give up on Kaitlyn so easily. Lois hired her own private investigator to gather more information. Pat Caristo, the investigator, was quite well paid and famous. Kaitlyn's insurance claim was due to an insurance fraud, a fraud she had not committed by herself. It was the result of being tied up with an infamous criminal organization. Kaitlyn and Dung had gone to Southern California in April that year. They became involved in the scam when Dung hit another car, but this entire thing was pre-planned. In March, Kaitlyn had used her mother's credit card to rent a car. A Vietnamese gang set up a car accident to get insurance money. Participants in the staged accident were supposed to claim soft tissue injuries to their necks and lower backs, receiving treatment from a complicit doctor. A law firm in Orange County, California, managed all the insurance claims. Kaitlyn and her boyfriend received $1,500 as their portion of the settlement. Initially, everything was completely fine, but Pat Caristo had some more information. Kaitlyn found out that it was not just a $1,500 scam. It was a multi-million-dollar settlement. If Kaitlyn was breaking up with a criminal, she was possibly considered to be compromised. Could it be that she was targeted? An interesting development was that the Vietnamese paralegal, whose number had been called from her apartment, was responsible for setting up the car accident for insurance scams. 2 men were charged with fatally shooting Kaitlyn, but the case was dismissed by the DA because there was not enough evidence to prove anything. It was all circumstantial, and even that was too scarce to prove they were behind it. But originally, there were 4 of them. The arrest was based on a statement from a teenager, Robert Garcia, who later claimed he only confessed after many hours of police bullying and scaring. Garcia stated he was with Dennis Martinez in the back seat of Yuva's Camaro and witnessed the shooting, identifying Miguel as the shooter and alleging that Yuva dared him to do it. However, it was later discovered that Robert Garcia was incarcerated at a juvenile detention center at the time of the shooting. The case was dismissed 18 months later, but the damage was already done. Since he was incarcerated, it made it impossible to have been an eyewitness. Consequently, the district attorney dropped all charges due to a lack of evidence. Juvenal Escobedo was 21 when he and 3 other young men from his Martinez Town neighborhood were arrested and charged with the slaying of Kaitlyn Arquette. Shortly after the charges were announced, his life changed forever. Escobedo had aspirations of opening a mechanic shop or becoming a police officer before his wrongful arrest. The fallout from the case and the accompanying publicity dramatically altered the course of his life. The book written by Lois Duncan, who took the life of my daughter, surrounding a mother's quest for her daughter's perpetrator, mentioned his name throughout as one of the main suspects, further embedding his association with the crime in the public's mind. The wrongful arrest shattered Escobedo's plans and prospects. He became hesitant to reveal his full name and struggled to secure the kinds of jobs he wanted. The stigma of being linked to such a high-profile case lingered, making it nearly impossible for him to rebuild his life and pursue his original dreams. There were strange circumstances surrounding the investigation. On July 21st, 1989, the day of Kaitlyn's funeral, Sharon Smith, the last person to see Kaitlyn before the shooting, missed the funeral because she was in the emergency room with a severely wounded arm. Although she claimed the injury was caused by her pet dog, the scar suggested otherwise, and Sharon refused to sign a permit to release the emergency room report, raising suspicions of intimidation. Later that evening, Dong Nguyen was stabbed in the abdomen in the room of one of the men who provided his alibi for the night of the shooting. While this was labeled an alleged taking your own life attempt, the circumstances strongly indicated otherwise, suggesting he may have been intimidated as well. 2 weeks after Kaitlyn's slaying, Ray Padilla, Dung's close friend and illegal substance supplier, allegedly attempted to take his own life by slashing his wrist. On the same day, Padilla's friends, Elena Chavez and Kathy Sanchez, who were with him at the time, also had their arms and wrists slashed in what were also deemed alleged attempts on taking their own lives. Why would completely normal, healthy people all want to end their lives at the same time on the same day? It did not make sense. Rather big coincidence. On February 11th, 1990, 3 weeks after his arrest with Miguel Garcia and Yuvie Escobedo, Dennis Marty Martinez was found with a slashed wrist, another alleged taking your own life attempt, but he survived. On February 4th, 1992, shortly after being released from prison when charges were dropped, Miguel Garcia was shot in the abdomen in an incident labeled as an alleged taking your own life attempt. He survived despite the bullet nearly paralyzing him. On September 24th, 2003, Robert Garcia, initially claimed by APD to be an eyewitness to Miguel Garcia shooting Kaitlyn, was found passed away due to an illegal substance overdose with his body dragged into an alley. But Pat Caristo, the investigator, had her doubts. She pursued a lead. A man named Paul Apodaca had been in the vicinity. The 21-year-old would go to prison for assault charges much later, and Caristo ended up visiting him in 1995. Paul was incarcerated for assault against his 14-year-old sister, which is deeply disturbing. The man was very cooperative according to the investigator. He immediately admitted that he was at the scene of the crime, but he did hesitate a little when Caristo asked him if someone was with him the night of July 16, 1989. He got defensive, snapping, "What do you mean somebody was with me? Who said somebody was with me? Nobody was with me." He was also quite curious, asking, "How did you find me?" Pat Caristo found it interesting, but she was not able to prove anything with just a defensive attitude. Paul told Pat that he was in the neighborhood that night to buy illegal substances from his dealer, Ray Lee Padilla. Padilla is the brother of an Albuquerque Police Department undercover narcotics officer, who is also a friend of Mary Ann Wallace, the first officer dispatched to the scene. This led the private investigator to suspect possible police corruption in the case, and ties to Dong Nguyen, as Ray Padilla was his friend too. The following year, in 1989, when Paul Apodaca was arrested for shooting a victim from his car, he tried to get off by presenting another man's ID that showed him to be Ray Lee Padilla. Kaitlyn's mother knew this was either a setup or something serious. Her 1973 book, I Know What You Did Last Summer, became an even more of an international hit when Hollywood decided to buy rights from Lois Duncan, and loosely based on her book, they released a movie of the same title in 1997. Now, Lois had a lot of income that could be used to find Kaitlyn's assailant. Tragically, nobody tied these cases together. There was nothing to link them together at all. All 3 cases separately went cold. Days, weeks, months, years, and finally decades would pass. Sadly, Lois Duncan, after dedicating her life to finding her daughter's assailant, would pass away in 2016, the mystery still unsolved. In 2021, a man was picked up by the New Mexico Police Department when he violated his probation. Homeless and possibly suffering from heat stroke, he expressed a desire to talk to the police. Originally from Albuquerque, his name was Paul Apodaca. He had a troubled past that included a series of violent crimes in the late 1980s and early 1990s. His arrest and subsequent confessions brought new light to several cold cases, revealing his involvement in some cold cases during that period. His life had spiraled into instability and homelessness, which resulted in his recent encounter with law enforcement. This man had hung in shame was confessing to gruesome crimes he committed against teenage girls. The detective was quite shocked. She had not expected the perpetrator to come forward, especially since these crimes had been committed decades ago. Before he went on to say anything further, the detective quickly read him his Miranda rights so that the confession could be admissible in court. He went on to say something that shocked the officer. Paul Apodaca went on, speaking from memory, but did not know his victims' names. 3 decades had passed. The detective did not understand. Why now, after all these years? The detectives realized who all the victims were from the dates, locations, and circumstances. He allegedly confessed to the violent slayings as he spoke about his hatred for women and provided detectives with information that only the assailant could have known. Paul's history was quite disturbing. He was charged with assaulting his 14-year-old stepsister in 1995. He was a registered offender in New Mexico. Paul Apodaca's criminal activities began on June 22, 1988, when he targeted Althea Oakley. Paul, who was working as a security guard at the Technical Vocational Institute, which is now Central New Mexico Community College, noticed her and began to follow her. Despite Althea smiling at him, he viciously attacked her. He later admitted to police that he followed her along Buena Vista Boulevard to the Lobo parking lot, where he intended to assault her at knife point. He admitted to stabbing her multiple times. In addition to Althea's case, he later confessed to taking the lives of 2 other young women and intimately assaulting 3 others between 1988 and 1993. He admitted to coming across Stella Gonzales in September 1988, and he also told the authorities that he was driving by the girls when he shot Stella. There was no motive. She was just an easy target for him. One of the assaults aside from these 3 from 1993 had been stuck in the assault kit backlog and had been matched to his through the CODIS DNA database. The case was then reopened. According to Lois Duncan's other daughter, Kaitlyn's sister, Carrie Arquette, she could feel her mother's presence in the days leading up to the arrest. She felt like her mother was looking down and would finally have peace. Paul's actions had made her all about Kaitlyn. She could never overcome losing a child at that age. Paul confessed to taking the life of these women, explaining that his actions stemmed from deep-seated hatred and jealousy toward women, influenced by witnessing men mistreat women during his upbringing. He believed women preferred bad guys and resented being rejected despite trying to be nice. Juvenal Escobedo, now 55, has been anxiously awaiting updates on the case, regularly checking TV stations for answers. When Paul Apodaca was arrested in 2021, it resurfaced all his painful memories. For the past 2 years, he was battling sleepless nights, worrying that he might somehow be dragged back into the situation. The past 2 years have also brought significant changes to Juvenal's life. He welcomed his first grandchild and rekindled his passion for painting, a hobby he had enjoyed in high school but had set aside for decades. Upon learning that Paul pleaded guilty, Juvenal found himself still trying to process the entire situation. He felt relieved that Kaitlyn Arquette and her mother could now find peace. However, he also yearned for reparation and clarity about how he became involved in the case, and he expressed a desire for a share of any book earnings related to the story. Many believed that Paul Apodaca was homeless, broke, and unemployed, so he confessed to the crimes as a way to have free food and shelter. Others believed there is something more sinister at play. While his lawyer insisted that he was innocent of the slayings, and only gave the confession because he was intoxicated and not mentally well, Paul had pled guilty to 5 charges of ending someone's life. On January 25, 2024, Paul Apodaca, at 56 years old, was sentenced to 62 years with 45 years in prison, but there are rumors that this is a cover-up. Is Paul Apodaca truly behind these heinous crimes? Because Kaitlyn Arquette's tragedy is far more complicated than the way Paul described it. True, he knew details only the assailant knew, but was he hired as a hitman for the Vietnamese gang Kaitlyn was involved with? The circumstances surrounding Kaitlyn's tragedy are certainly suspicious. So many unanswered questions,